Meeting will be recorded and a copy archived for future viewing. Could all participants please mute themselves when not speaking in order to avoid any background noise or feedback when other participants are speaking in the meeting. If a participant wishes to speak, could you please put your hand up if you can be seen on screen, or if not, please use the raise hand or chat functions. And if any participant has difficulty hearing or being heard when you are addressing the committee, then please let either myself as the chairman or the democratic officer know. If you have a webcam, try turning this off, as it may help with broadband or Wi-Fi bandwidth, so at least you can hear and be heard. Other than that, welcome to the meeting. If we start off then with agenda item 1, which is apologies for absence. Do we have any apologies?
Yes, Chair. Mr. Paul Lewis has given his apologies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Gareth. If we move on to item 2 then, which is the minutes of the last meeting held on the 24th of May. Does anybody have anything to raise regarding the minutes? Okay, in that case, I propose that we sign them off if we have a seconder.
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair. If we move on to item 3 then, to receive declarations of interest, do we have any declarations? I take that as a no. If we move on to item 4 then, reference from Cabinet, the annual corporate safeguarding report.
I think I'm taking this one, Chair.
Thanks, Cass.
As you said, this is the annual safeguarding report, which has been referred here from Cabinet. It was discussed at Cabinet on the 7th of June. Members will be used to the report. We regularly bring this update so that members know the work that's been undertaken with regards to safeguarding across all of the different services in the Council. Just to reassure members that there is a corporate safeguarding group which has actually been in existence now for quite a few years, and that is continuing to meet and actually has met very recently. So this report pulls together for you the activity that's taken place across the services during the past year. And really from the audit perspective, it's around reassuring you that there is a governance framework in place, that the risks associated with safeguarding are being monitored and are being managed appropriately by the different services. And just to make the link really, that this is also reflected in the corporate risk register, which obviously comes to this committee as well on a quarterly basis. So I wasn't going to say much more than that, Chair, but I think there are a few of us on the call. If anybody's got any questions, that we will try and answer them between us.
Okay, thank you for that, Caris. If I open the floor to questions from members. Do we have any questions? I take that as a no, which is in that case as a reference if we note the report then. Thank you for that, Caris. If we move on to the next item, which is another reference, this time the coronavirus update.
Thank you, Chair. That one's down for me to present. Cabinet have referred this to Governance and Audit Committee as part of contextual information for the corporate risk register. So I don't know whether you want me to describe the reference in isolation now, or whether you want me to summarise it as part of the risk register item later on in the agenda.
I'm happy to take it as part of the risk register, Tom. So if we move on then to the next item, which is the corporate risk register.
And that one is for me to present to you this evening, Chair. Thank you very much indeed. The Q4 risk register is before you this evening. I'm also joined by a couple of colleagues from the Highways team to explore the flooding aspects of the environmental sustainability risk, which committee were particularly interested in at their last meeting. As a committee, you also asked for some more information about the additional learning needs risk. Unfortunately, both the chief officers in that team are on leave today, so I've asked them if they'll attend your next meeting, if that's okay. okay, Chair. In terms of the overall corporate risk register, there are 16 risks on the register. There haven't been any additions and there are no proposed deletions this quarter. Of the statuses, 5 are being scored medium high, 10 score a medium status, and 1, which is safeguarding, remains on the register but with a medium low risk rating. There haven't been any significant movements in terms of risk statuses during the 4th quarter, but we are very mindful that the pandemic is impacting on many facets of the risks that are contained within the register. So it may well be that there is some movement that we'd expect to happen on those in the coming months. The main shifts that have happened in terms of forecast direction of travel, so what we're expecting in terms of those risk ratings, have been upward trajectories for Brexit, coronavirus and the reshaping risk. We're anticipating that safeguarding and the Welsh Community Care Information System will move move to an upward trajectory rather, and the information security risk will move from a previous downward trajectory to a static position. The report provides members with some information security risk information, a summary around the waste considerations, integrated health and social care, and the environmental sustainability risk, which, as I say, colleagues are here to discuss this evening, as well as welfare reform, safeguarding and WCCIS. And they're picked out for some commentary specifically because there have been some developments within those areas which are flagged in the report for you. I've asked the team this quarter to put some information into the report around emerging risks and issues. So coronavirus, Chair, is contained within the risk register, as members are aware. The Cabinet reference is to provide you with information about the Council's management arrangements associated with the ongoing response and recovery from the pandemic. So that report sets out the kind of context within which we're working. The report also sets out some information about the impact that Brexit is having. Since the last update to the risk register, a number of changes have happened around travel within and outside of the EU, right to remain, trading arrangements kicking in, data sharing arrangements, funding and supply chain disruption. So the report considers those things. When I took the report to the strategic leadership team recently, Chair, they've asked for a specific piece of work to be undertaken over the summer to explore the impact that Brexit may be having on council services. So I've got my team working with heads of service to look at issues associated with supply chain disruption, the cost of supplies and materials, labour availability, for example, and that will be used to inform the next iteration of the risk register when it comes before your committee after the recess. So just in summary of the risk register itself before any questions, and obviously we could hear from Mike and from Clive. 64% of the actions have been completed by the end of the year. 36% rather, or 48 actions have been attributed a red status because of slippage. And COVID has been cited as a contributory reason for slippage in several of those areas. So we're bringing this, as always, Chair, to your committee for consideration and for any comments to be referred to Cabinet when they consider the risk register after the recess.
Thank you for that, Tom. Do we have any questions or comments from members? Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Tom, for the updates. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Mike and Clive regarding the flooding incidents from before Christmas. I think that was that's been something that's highlighted in previous meetings. Obviously, the Brexit and the coronavirus situations are evolving and being dealt with as we go by. I just wanted to flag up very briefly, or just question the status of both waste and unauthorised deprivation of liberty safeguards, DOLS. There's only, I think, one exception under the waste, which is about the waste transfer station at Barry, which has been given planning permission, I think, in the meantime, since Q4 took place. So I'm just clarifying what that really means for for waste. I mean, I'd say it's got a downward direction of travel, but what does that actually mean then? And similarly, I just want to get an understanding, as I've raised over the years, about where DOLS really is, within our risk register, because obviously it's been high or amongst the highest rated for the entire time that we've been having risk registers brought to this committee. So the entire time I've been on this committee, in effect, isn't it? Does that just mean that it just stays at that high level, high medium level, because it's not soluble? I know we've brought in Lance in the past to sort of talk us through this, but it just seems a little bit odd to me that it doesn't get that high a focus around anything else I see until I come to this committee, where it's a very high risk, or a moderately high risk rather. Sorry. Thanks, Chair.
Tom, do you want to?
Certainly, if it's acceptable, Chair, I'll take away the issue around waste to clarify the specifics as part of that, and ensure that an update is circulated to all elected members after this meeting, and also then obviously reflected in the Q1 risk register update. My understanding, Councillor Johnson, is exactly that, around the deprivation of liberty safeguards, in terms of almost reaching a position of not being able to do anything more, but still recognising that the risk exists. But clearly it's an area that is of concern, so I'll also undertake to get an update from the director and ensure that that's circulated with the waste transfer station update as well.
I've noted Councillor Wilson, so I'll call you to speak next. I've just noticed that the head of legal has raised her hand, so I don't know if that was in response to something that Councillor Johnson raised.
Yeah, it was just to add to the comments of Tom, and just to share with the committee that we have had some investment in legal support to assist with the DOLS issue. So we do have a dedicated lawyer. I'm not saying it completely resolves the issue, far from it, but certainly there's been significant movement in assisting with addressing the issue.
Thank you for that, Debbie. If we move on then to Councillor Wilson.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just really an observation, really, and I know it's become a bigger issue, especially outside the council, but it might become an issue inside the council, and that's clearly, it could be a consequence of COVID. It could also be a consequence of Brexit as well, and that's obviously attracting the right calibre of labour to the council, because clearly we know anecdotally that an awful lot of employers are struggling to recruit labour in lots of different areas at the moment. And I was just wondering, perhaps, do we need to look at our heat-seeking map in particular, which you regard it as a fairly low risk, and perhaps slightly move up to a higher risk, and also look at maybe steps to try and mitigate that? I know we do quite a bit of training. Perhaps maybe we need to get more training and more about thinking about succession planning, especially amongst some of our younger staff, so they can feel they have a career in the Belgium organ rather than use it as a stepping stone to other jobs elsewhere.
Thank you, Mark. Tom. Yes, thank you, Councillor Wilson. I think that that does demonstrate the kind of cross-cutting nature of the risk register, and particularly the risks associated with the exit from the EU and coronavirus. The risk contained within the register around the workforce needs does reflect some of those issues. However, you're right to flag it as something that we need to do some work on, and that's one of the aspects that that SLT have asked for. In addition, I know that the head of HR is also undertaking some work around the council's HR strategy and workforce planning arrangements, and that considers those kind of issues about availability, attraction, retention. So we can reflect those developments in the summer as well. And I think Tracy may want to that, Chair.
Tracy.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Councillor Curran, thank you, Tom. So, yeah, we are currently doing some work, Councillor Wilson, in relation to our strategic workforce planning. and specifically looking at operational plans within certain teams and where we may have potential issues. So you'll be aware that one of those areas is within social services and children's services, and we're looking at our attraction strategy currently as part of our capacity planning to look at what we can do differently in that space and perhaps influence some of the gaps that we've got currently in terms of recruiting additional people into those roles. They're not the only team. Obviously, we've got further teams that we've got concerns on, but our business partners are currently working through that with the teams at present. We're also doing some work on our talent and succession plans. So all of the heads of service are working on those currently. They have to be in, or they had to be in by the end of June, and we're working on what that collectively looks like as a council currently in terms of our talent and succession plans and what our talent pipeline is and how we can develop a learning and training plan built around that. So those will be things that we'll be working on in the coming months, but they are underway, if that gives you some reassurance.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tracy. I'm just going to come back, if that's okay, Chair. Just a couple observations, really. I noticed that we have got Mike Clogg on the call as well, and I know Mike's area in particular is always struggling to recruit staff with specialist skills and knowledge, especially in things like traffic management and road maintenance and road management is a particular area. And I just wonder, perhaps, you know, do we have dialogues with other councils in particular to try and share people around, because these people are very much in short supply, and it's obvious why, because a lot of consultancies appoint these people and use these people, and some of these people go on, as we know, that is an issue. So one thing I was going to ask is, do we have those discussions, and do we perhaps look at, I know we've got these new bodies starting up from September, you know, these big committees, and perhaps maybe that's something, that an area that we could explore with the big committees. That's the first point. And the second point is, obviously, one of the things you rightly said about succession planning, I totally get that. And obviously, one of the issues about succession planning is to make sure that we have an agile workforce as well, because things are moving so fast in terms of technology, as we've seen with COVID. You know, we have got to be really agile going forward to make sure that people can do front office jobs, back office jobs, IT jobs, admin jobs, as well as doing their own work as well. And perhaps, you know, what are we doing about that to try and encourage more agile working apart from just investing in technology?
Thank you for that, Mark. I don't know if Tom would like to address any of that.
I think Tracy's got her hand up, Chair.
Oh, Tracy.
More learned than I am.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just in terms of how we liaise wider, we do have monthly meetings across with our other HR directors or heads of service, and we do share best practice and you know, anything that others are doing in order to improve the situation with certain roles and certain vacancy gaps. We do work together on that. We're also very aware that actually we can't be seen to be poaching off certain teams as well, so we do need to support that process wider to ensure that actually we're bringing through skills as opposed to just you know, taking them from other local authorities and increasing the gap in wider across Wales. So we do that, and we share best practice regularly on a month-to-month basis on how we could potentially improve that space. Our learning and development team are currently working with Social Care Wales and to align our strategy in terms of the recruitment from a social services perspective to the wider Social Care Wales strategy around talent succession and succession pipelines. And we're looking at opportunities via apprenticeship schemes, etc., to how we can bring that on in its infancy. From a talent and succession position and an agile working perspective, we're currently reviewing our agile working policy with our trade unions to look at how we can support a different way of working moving forward. And we're also looking at our working environments and how our accommodation can support that. You may be aware that our wellbeing survey that we undertook in the spring of 2021 supported the Wellbeing Survey of 2020, where the vast majority of our employees who can work from home wish to continue from work from home from a hybrid perspective. So they wanted a balance of both working from home and working in the office. So we're currently working through that and looking at how that's the best way in which we can do that for us as a local authority. And we're looking at that from our talent and succession plans. One thing I will say that we have identified as a local authority is our numbers in terms of attraction have increased. So that's not including some of the areas where we've got established gaps. So children's services and some of our teams within waste and our planning teams, for example. But wider, from a business admin perspective, from an administrative perspective, we are actually seeing a greater number of applicants now to those roles than we had done before. And we're starting to do a piece of work on why that might be, whether people see us as more secure in terms of employment moving forward as a result of the pandemic or not. We're unsure at this stage, but we are tracking that information and quite happy to bring that back if that was something that you wish to see in the future.
Can I come back? Beg my indulgence. Thank you, George. Coming back on your last point, Tracy, that is very interesting. And it might mean that people are starting to move away from perhaps more insecure sectors of the economy, perhaps to more secure sectors. So people might be moving, say, from hospitality, for example, going to do maybe working for the council more. And also perhaps maybe it could be that the council's got a higher profile than it has done for a while, so that people become more aware of jobs in local government. I always think sometimes people are not really aware what people do in local councils. I mean, obviously we do as councillors and officers do, but that's the wider population do. And perhaps maybe the COVID focus has heightened people's awareness as to what's happening. So I would be very interested to see why we're and also be interested to see not just the quantity, but also the quality of that supply of labour or potential supply of labour. I think that would be interesting to look at, as well as to look at the age profile. And also, are we meeting our, our protected characteristics as well? You know, are we meeting those not quotas, but are we reflecting the population around us? Because I think that's also important as well. And are we recruiting, for example, sufficient role speakers as well, especially in frontline positions where they have to meet the public? I'd be interested to see on that development. But thank you for that update, Tracy. That was really helpful.
Okay, do we have any further questions or comments? Okay, if we move on then.
Okay, Chair. So this is me. We're talking about the draft annual governance statement.
Sorry, Chair. To cut across. I thought Tom was going to have a discussion about the flooding aspects, and that was why Clive and Michael were in the room with us tonight. Just checking if that's still the plan before we move on to the annual governance statements. Sorry.
My apologies. I'll bow out.
Thank you.
I know everyone's very keen to get to the AGS, but as you requested previously, committee were interested in understanding around some of the flooding issues associated with the environmental and sustainability risks. So within the report, colleagues have provided a bit more information within there, but I don't know whether, Chair, you'd like Mike and Clive to give you a bit of an overview in terms of that aspect of the risk.
Yeah, that sounds sensible.
Great, thank you.
Shall I start off, Tom? And Chair, thanks, Councillor Cow. Can I just warn you that my connection seems to be pretty poor, and I'm fading in and out, so I might disappear as I'm talking. But yeah, just to perhaps go back on what Tom has mentioned, there was a report completed in February to Cabinet, which identified our response to the floods on the 23rd of December. I think there's quite a bit of information in there, and I think that's replicated in the risk management report that that Tom has presented. You know, I think there's a lot of talk in the report about environmental sustainability in relation and the flooding aspects associated. I think we need to perhaps remember that you know, flooding is a complex issue, and whereas you know, climate change is no doubt having an impact, and you know, the intensity of storms perhaps is increasing, causing higher risk for flooding. There are many other reasons why flooding occurs throughout the Vale, throughout Wales. And it's not purely the you know, due to climate change. For instance, you know, a lot of or flooding can occur on you know, where in the built environment where houses are being built on floodplains, and I think that perhaps very much reflects one of the situations that we're dealing with from the 23rd in terms of Dinas Powys. I think Dinas Powys is on a floodplain. And you know, that's it's probably a well-known fact that Dinas Powys has been at risk of flooding, or is at risk of flooding, and that's been known for many years. And as a consequence, we are aware that the National Resources Wales have been looking at progressing a scheme for a flood alleviation scheme for Dinas Powys, and they undertook some considerable consultation on that probably 18 months ago. Unfortunately, they did receive some significant opposition to the proposals at that time. I think possibly the flooding that's occurred subsequently on the 23rd of December may have focused a number of people's, individuals and groups' minds as to you know, what is exactly happening in Dinas Powys and what needs to be done. But yeah, just to perhaps move on, and you know, just in terms of setting the scene, we have we had an immediate response to the flooding event on the 23rd. We brought in additional resource in order to start looking at clearing drains, making sure things were flowing freely in that respect. Obviously, we had a number of meetings with local members, with National Resources Wales and Welsh Water, and we started a significant investigation. And as you're probably all aware, it's our one of our, or the council's legal duties under the Flood and Water Management Act to produce Section 19 reports in relation to significant flooding incidents. And generally, the trigger that we use for significant flooding incidents is where there have been some, I think it's probably nine residential properties or a couple of commercial properties flooded, or a highly critical infrastructure, such as a hospital or a school. So we have been doing a lot of work in relation to that investigation. We did appoint a consultant to assist us with that work. And we are at a point now where we've been concentrating on two reports, one for Sully and one for Dinas Powys. And we're at a point where we're just about ready to publish the report for Sully, and that will potentially be published later on this week or early next week. We have the copy of the draft report. And we're just making final reviews of that. The report for Dinas Powys will likely come later in August, and possibly mid to late August, and we'll be publishing that as well. We'll be putting that on the council's website when it's completed. I think that covers some of the main points, but I'm happy to take any questions, and we do have Clive Moon with us. Clive is the manager of my environmental team, and he's got a vast knowledge and experience in dealing with flooding in the Vale, and Clive can also answer any questions if there are any.
Do we have any questions or comments? Councillor Wilson and then Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for that summary, Mike. I mean, obviously, you know, flooding, you know, is going to be around more and more, and especially flush flooding, and it's going to be a bigger issue. I mean, I noticed that Welsh Government is now looking at that with schemes now, with development schemes going forward, as it were. And clearly, you know, these 1 in a 25-year, 1 in 50 events are going to become more and more common. And what I'm really, you know, concerned about is, especially in Penarth, where Penarth doesn't get too much flooding, to be honest, because it's quite high level. But there are areas like Elfrid Avenue, for example, which is in my ward, where there is occasional flush flooding, does occur, but some of it occurs because of drains are not properly, you know, sucked out of debris and material. And I think that is an issue that we need to be focusing on, especially when it comes to the autumn, where we have a lot of leaves falling from trees, as we know. And sometimes, because of the way that the weather works, those city leaves seem to start occurring from mid-August onwards, rather than September, October, as it used to be. Certainly, I can see the indications myself, just in Penarth now, starting yellowing of leaves even now, even though it's not even late July. So perhaps we need to be looking at the gullies in particular, to clean them out quite more often than perhaps we do so. I know you're going to say it's a resource issue. And of course, everything is a resource issue, Mike. But perhaps maybe we need to, you know, start this process earlier on rather than later, in order to try and reduce the impact of this. And also, perhaps we also need to be looking at, you know, some of the areas. We're trying to encourage more residents, in particular, to lay down grass rather than hard standing, because that, you know, we need natural soakaways, and this is an issue perhaps we need to be working on, not just on new developments, but also existing developments as well, to try and encourage and incentivize people to lay turf down rather than putting down, you know, and also looking at sort of like mixed hybrid solutions, like something like grasscrete, for example. Even if the council can't provide it, perhaps maybe they could refer people on to a good supplier of grasscrete, and perhaps look favourably when it comes to building waste planning, whatever, if people want to put it on their own properties and areas, because we've got to try and reduce the amount of runoff into drains. And I think, you know, that's the strategy that I would like to see. Perhaps, you know, I know that's what you're probably thinking, but I think we need to perhaps do a promotional strategy on that sort of area in order to try and reduce it. So a bit of maintenance, a bit of kind of nudging of the community to say, try and lay down grass, or try and lay down some grasscrete as a compromise, instead of putting a hard stand down in front of your house. Correct, but thank you.
Yeah, if you want me to make a few comments on that, and there's a number of issues you've raised there, Councillor Wilson, and some very good points you've made as well. You know, you've mentioned Elfrid Avenue as an example, and you know, I'm not 100% sure why we get the flooding in that area. You know, as I mentioned before, you know, flooding can be a complex issue. It can be a mixture of reasons why flooding occurs in any specific area. But I can assure you that, you know, I've mentioned that we do Section 19 reports, and there's triggers for when we have to legally produce those reports. Even if we have flooding, even if we don't have to produce a Section 19 report legally, I can assure you that we do investigate all flooding incidents, especially those that involve internal property flooding. Because we have a responsibility as a lead local flood authority. We want to understand situations better. We want to try and improve environments and try and reduce the risk of flooding to individuals. So you know, there is that, or that's part of our work as such. In terms of the drains, I fully accept your position, and we would like to be in a position where we're targeting drains that are more problematic, or that we know are more problematic more often than those drains that never give us any problems. And to that end, I can advise that we've recently purchased a new asset management system for neighbourhood services and transport, and we're just in the process of adopting that system. And the hope is that in the future we will be recording details of well, drains is just one aspect of one asset that the system will be using, but we will be recording locations, details, maintenance regimes, details of when we get problems with drains in the future, so that we can build up an entire picture of our drainage network, understand which ones are more prone to problems or obstructions, whether that's by leaves or other for other reasons. And then we can look at or undertaking or putting in place maintenance regimes which reflect those risks, i.e. the higher risk drains and gullies would be cleansed on a more regular basis, or perhaps at a specific time of year, and the ones that we don't see or have problems with, then they would be on a much longer schedule. So we have that process coming through. I have to say it's not going to be a short-term fix, because building up the data in terms of understanding what the risks are to the drainage network is probably going to take at least, well, I was going to say 12 months, but I think it's more like 18, 24 months before we build up a reasonable knowledge, so that we can start to look at how we rearrange our maintenance arrangements for highway drainage. But certainly the process has started. I think that's an encouragement for everyone. It should be. You've mentioned leaves are a specific problem at a particular time of year. It's really difficult to keep on top of that problem. And you've mentioned resource. Resource is always going to be a problem for us, but we do try and manage things as best we can. And hopefully the asset management system will help us use our resources a lot better in the future. So a number of things perhaps that will address your concerns. The final thing perhaps to mention, and you've referred to SUD solutions in terms of dealing with surface water runoff or dealing with rainfall. That's obviously something we're very keen on. We have recently, over the last couple of years, taken on SUD's approval body status for the Vale of Glamorgan, and as part of that, then we have legal responsibilities to ensure that any new works, new developments, anything exceed 100 metres squared, adequately considers sustainable drainage systems and incorporates that into any design or any new works. And hopefully going forward in the future, that will certainly add up to helping reduce flood risk in many areas, certainly with new developments coming through. And I know Clive is certainly very, very strict with developers on their drainage systems and how they drain sites, and we are keen that we don't allow any detriment or any works that would cause detriment to other properties or downstream. I think possibly I've covered most things there. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Clive wants to come in, Mike.
Sorry?
I think Clive wants to come in.
He does, yes. Yeah. Yes. Over to you, Clive.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Chair. I think Mike just about covered everything. Some of the points about SAB, yes, I totally agree. And I think the comments about Grasscrete or similar sort of products, in terms of new developments, we'd actively, promote that. And for developers to get through the SAB process, they'll have to be compliant with a range of statutory standards, not just to manage the risk of flooding and the volume of runoff from sites, but also water quality and those other sort of benefits with green SUDs. So I'm a big advocate of that. More widely, Councillor Wilson touched on Elford Avenue and Penarth. We have various sort of strands of work that sort of touched on that. We are aware of flooding in December that happened in Penarth, more localised sort of clusters of flooding in a couple of different locations. And we've had issues in Penarth historically. it can be quite hard to sort of identify key risk areas, but the National Surface Water Flood Maps are actually pretty good at identifying areas where you're most likely to get internal property flooding. You do get exceptions where you have low threshold and things like that, but we use those mapping products to inform things like our local flood risk management strategy, and we've got a draft flood risk management plan that draw on the latest data sets to try and identify high risk areas or areas where we have larger clusters of properties. In Penarth, because there's quite a heavy involvement by with Welsh Water assets, so there's a lot of combined systems and public sewers. Welsh Water are currently developing a drainage and wastewater management plan. We've been a consultee on that process as the council. I've represented from a drainage perspective. There is talk of assessing their networks and looking at the potential in high risk catchments for retrofitting SUDs, like you mentioned about sort of regrassing over front gardens or breaking up hard surfaces and using porous surfaces instead. At this stage, I don't know whether anywhere in the Vale is going to be identified as one of those areas, but if we're not, Penarth has probably got a good example where going forward, because we have this sort of diffuse surface water flood risk, we would probably look to take that on as a lead local flood authority anyway. So we'd look to assess what are the potential benefits, because sometimes, unfortunately, just replacing verges with grass won't be enough to deal with the kind of magnitude of storm that we saw in December, or worse with climate change, or a higher magnitude event. But it is good to understand, will that relieve pressure up to a certain point on the Welsh Water network? Will it help reduce numbers, or do we need to go one step further and have sort of flood alleviation schemes, larger storage areas like Mike touched on for NRW are considering for Dinas Powys elsewhere in the Vale. So there is other work where we're sort of liaising with other risk management authorities as a lead local flood authority as well, to manage or to consider risk. I would just touch that in terms of the impact of climate change at present, most of the current guidance, there's been no significant changes recently coming through from the IPCC or UK climate projections set up in the UK. So through the planning process, the SAB process, any new development will have an allowance on top of that for increased magnitude rainfall or sea level rise for coastal developments. Most of the documents that manage that are sort of refreshed on a 6-year process. So as the latest science comes through and we become more or less concerned about sea level rise or the intensity of rainfall, frequency of events, that sort of gets fed through the regulatory process as well and gets picked up with designs. Now, obviously, once you've built something, it's static pretty much. And as part of our local flood risk management strategy, we do also need to identify if we've got these areas that become more and more at risk of flooding, and then we may have to implement schemes in the future. Hopefully not that soon, but depending on climate change and the predictions, it could be sooner rather than later. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Mark, is that a separate point or just to come back on?
That is a new hand.
Right. I'll go to Councillor Johnson first in that case.
Thank you.
I was going to suggest Mark just carried on actually, but if Mike wants to give way, there's a slight, I think it's a slightly difficult topic at the moment because the most interesting point is obviously the Section 19 reports, and Michael and Clive have an advantage over councillors in that they've seen the drafts and know what's in it, whereas we don't, and we're waiting for those to be distributed and published. I don't really want to go into huge amounts of detail here, because this is the Governance and Audit Committee, and I think it's right that Environment and Regeneration is the committee that looks in this in detail. And I'm sure that the Section 19 reports on both Sully and Dinas Powys will be going there fairly shortly after the summer. So I just want to really kind of focus on a couple of quick points. Firstly, irrespective of this, I mean, it was back in one of the first actions when I joined the council back in 2013 was to ask the Environment and Regeneration Committee, or E&E as it then was, to have an annual report on flooding. That's usually happened, but not always. I think it's really important that it does happen on an annual basis, both focusing on flooding within the Vale and also the coastal erosion side, which I think has sort of taken the lion's share of sort of the discussion in the last few years. It's clear that dealing with project takes a very long time. It took a long time to finish the Colebrook catchment area. With the Llanmaes stuff is still here on red. and obviously there's, you know, sort of because of PERDA for Welsh Government, there's been delays on there were delays on the, you know, revising the local flood management strategy. So it feels like these things take a large project, they take a very long time, and they're quite important. So it feels to me, and I've raised earlier, for example, the fact that Dolls is, you know, sort of gets a very high profile in our risk register. To me, flooding feels to me to get a lower risk register rating than it deserves, considering the other frequency which it happens and the impact and the length of time it takes us to resolve it. So I think that's a consideration for maybe Tom as much as Michael and Clive, about, you know, the way in which that is flagged up within our systems here, because it feels to me that, you know, when it happens, obviously it's completely disastrous for those affected, and it feels a very big issue. So the impact as well as the likelihood both seem to be quite strong to me. So I feel that it feels like an underestimate of that risk, because when it happens, it's very big and it is fairly frequent. So I'd like, you know, sort of Tom to maybe consider what that looks like. The other point, just very quickly, is that Michael did refer to the previous NRW consultation in Dinas Powys, which was completed a couple of months before the flooding in December. Now, and I don't know quite, you know, I mean, obviously I'm aware that there was a fair amount of local disagreement on the proposals, but, you know, their outline business case recommended business as usual. You know, it's a very difficult one, but I don't want people to sort of be, you know, I find there's an awful lot there that needs to be unpacked within that and within section 19. And I'm looking forward to reading that report when it's available. But NRW, you know, didn't come out in their final report and say this is what you should do. They went for a business as usual approach, which, you know, I don't know the background to that, but that's what that report says. Thanks, Chair.
Mike, did either of you or Clive want to respond to any of that?
Well, I'm happy to discuss. Oh, Tom's got his hand up. I was going to say happy to discuss with Tom about an annual report and whether there's room and necessity for that in the calendar. You know, just in terms of the NRW position for Dinas Powys and the previous scheme, I think there is a lot of issues surrounding that. You know, I am aware that NRW had a significant opposition to the scheme that they proposed, which was a flood alleviation scheme in the fields just upstream of Dinas Powys, and you know, potentially for that reason, you know, because of the objections that they had, they shied away perhaps from progressing or promoting that scheme as a final solution. As again, complex issues in the Dinas Powys area. But I suppose just one other thing to mention is that we are working with the National Flood Forum, which combines both the Vale, which includes both the Vale and NRW and Welsh Water, with local residents on how we move forward with the flooding issues that have occurred in Dinas Powys, and meetings are ongoing, and there's another meeting planned with that group for mid-August.
Could I just quickly also, is there any comment on Llanmaes and progress there?
Shall I let Clive update you on that? Are you okay with that, Clive?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Llanmaes is progressing. We should have a planning application hopefully submitted in the next week, hopefully sooner. So the design is essentially complete for the scheme. There's a submission going in for planning. We've commenced negotiations with landowners. We're currently targeting an application to Welsh Government for funding later this calendar year, and still looking to construct the scheme within financial year, if possible. Obviously, depending on the timescales with planning, that may sort of affect the construction phase, but that's still the current plan. Yes, we, as an interim measure with land mice, because it's taken so long to implement the scheme. I mean, that was a particularly complicated one because Welsh Government built a road over elements of the scheme halfway through in bits and pieces. But as an interim measure, we did actually secure additional funding from Welsh Government to install property level protection measures on a number of houses in land mice. In fact, we offered it to the entire community because we were aware that there was a current and pressing need for something to happen to help protect the residents. And we've gone down a similar route in Sully. We've managed to secure some funding to undertake similar surveys and implement measures there, because we know that implementing a sort of an engineered solution isn't necessarily going to be clear cut or a quick win, whereas these measures can be installed at a property level more quickly. So we do use that as a sort of a tool in the armory just to get something in. It also helps make people aware that, I mean, ultimately the residents are responsible for protecting their own property, where there's this overriding sort of public interest, and we can do a scheme, or NRW can do a scheme to protect, we can do that, but ultimately people also need to try and do what they can, and some of that is about education and awareness raising, because we are still having a lot of people who kind of don't want to acknowledge the fact that they're in flood risk areas, and NRW have mapping available online, and it's very clearly signposted for people, but people still would rather sort of deny that, and because it's happened once, I'd much rather see people, if they have been flooded, prepare for the next time, plan for the worst, and hopefully they don't get flooded. But unfortunately, quite often we get people saying, oh, hopefully it won't happen again in my lifetime, or I won't be here next time. So in terms of land mice, we do have other schemes progressing through with Welsh Government funding as well, that we're looking to develop. But yes, the timeline for getting those through can be quite sort of protracted. Welsh Government have got measures in the new national strategy. They're keen to streamline the process and get stuff through. Part of that is streamlining the Section 19 reporting, because that's critical sort of evidence for schemes going forward. If we know we're reporting or capturing lots of reports of flooding, they're the areas we'll target for schemes. But I am conscious that a lot of the flooding in the Vale, although we've had significant flooding in Dinas Powys associated with sort of the main river, we have probably 2/3 of the flood risk in the Vale is actually surface water flood risk. So those harder to find spots, as Councillor Wilson sort of alluded to, where you only have to block a gully or do something and it starts to affect one or two houses. We have that more widely spread across the whole Vale, and that's where individual residents do need to sort of be aware of issues, deal with us, because if we're a highway authority, we need to clear a gully. Yes, we need to do that, but sometimes it's just the nature of the lay of the land. They're in the bottom of a valley, and people do need to look at whether they can take measures themselves as well. Thank you.
Chair, is it possible I can come back now?
Yes, did Tom want to come in before that?
If I may, Chair, it was just to say in response to Councillor Johnson's point in terms of reviewing the corporate risk here. We can absolutely do that now over the summer, and I'll work with Clive and Mike to do that. It looks as if inherently the risk score comes out as high, so it's the impact that the control environment has that the team have got in place, and obviously the extent to which those controls can be effective. So perhaps Mike and Clive, we can spend a bit of time together over the next couple of months, and we can reflect the various comments from committee and the information that you've provided this evening to just take a bit of a temperature check as to whether those controls feel like they're scored properly or not. And then perhaps we reflect some of that in any subsequent detailed report to the relevant scrutiny committee then.
Thank you for that, Tom. Mark, floor yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. I'm just going to come back. I mean, I think Councillor Johnson is right. It is a very high risk flooding because the impact is high. And if we're getting on this basis where we're looking at risk, it's not just it's a high impact, but it's more likely to happen, the frequency, then it's much more serious. So we've got to give it a higher risk, absolutely right. But I think one of the points that Clive rightly says, I think, is you've got to try and mitigate that risk, reduce the impact of that risk. And I think, okay, it might be incumbent upon residents. I think it's also incumbent upon members who represent residents also to point out certain bits. So what I'm going to do with you, Clara, I'll draw you up an email as to areas I know within the Stanwell ward where flooding does occur, mostly due to heavy rainfall not going away quickly. And I know there are places that I can easily identify. And I think perhaps it'd be useful for other members to do that as well. In fact, all the members of the council to recommend sort of hotspot areas in their own wards that they know that often do flood, and clearly that is an area which would help. The other thing I was also going to suggest, okay, you mentioned about individuals responsible, but also we're talking about housing department of the council, because remember we still have a number of council houses and flats, which are responsibility owned by the council as being a large landlord. But we also have registered social landlords as well, housing associations in particular, I was thinking, that also have a role. But a question I was going to ask you is, do you meet often to discuss these issues? And if so, how do you meet? Is it informal or is it formal? Should it perhaps be formal as a way to address some of these issues so that, you know, as you rightly said, we do have combined sewers in Penarth. I know we do. We have shared sewers, we have private sewers. A lot of them, as we know, thanks to legislation, have been taken over by Welsh Water. It's a big task for Welsh Water to take responsibility for all those. We know that some are not in a good state of repair. We are aware of that. And equally, we also got to think about, you know, managing our natural environment in terms of our wildlife as well, because I think that could help. Also, it could hinder, but I'm more looking at help. And also, we've got to look at our trees, our tree strategy, because it's all part of this mix. And to look at the kind of trees that we put in, does that help or would it hinder the flooding strategy? So these are things I do. So I wonder, perhaps, do you meet ever with these relevant stakeholders to look at flooding, you know, as a discrete topic rather than looking at the generalities?
Thank you, Chair. Mike, shall I respond to that? You happy?
Yes, please, Clive.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Wilson, Chair. Yes, in terms of well, I'll pick on housing. We do have meetings with representatives from housing, education, other departments within the council who've sort of got buildings or holdings. It tends to be as a sense approving body, because when they're coming forward in new developments, they have to comply with the standards. There's no exemption. So we do have those discussions. I think I would agree that there's an opportunity with the sort of the housing stock and the land ownership the council have got that we could potentially improve the situation. I know I did do the exercise once in the Colbert catchment because obviously of the flood scheme we put there, and I think if you look at all the land holding, highways and housing sort of stock, I think we've got about 50% of the catchment. So if we can't do something there, maybe, you know, we'd struggle elsewhere. There is an opportunity. We have met with different departments recently. I think it was the Green Infrastructure Plan, where we sort of talked about, from my perspective, the impact of SUDs going forward and trying to improve the situation in terms of runoff from developments. So I have been involved with those sort of more strategic discussions, both internally and externally as well. We sort of met with NRW, but I'd welcome the opportunity to have maybe a more focused discussion, because there is, as people have said, there's the opportunity to retrofit SUDs. Currently, there's no incentive for people to do that, and changing something costs more than not changing something. So I think it would have to be incentivised. That may come through Welsh Water, may decide that they have a priority area and they want to incentivise something. But if not, then maybe there is an opportunity as a council to promote more green infrastructure, retrofitting of sort of SUDs, the at-surface features that could replace some of those harder front gardens, paved areas that have sort of evolved over time.
Thank you for that, Clive. Councillor Norman.
Just a quickie, to pick up on what you were saying about developments, new developments. How much is taken into consideration with new developments about the sewerage system and the floodplains? Because I know for a local issue that we're having problems now with an overload of the sewerage system because the system is out of date. We've had so much development in the area and it's on the verge of not being able to cope. This is something I think needs to be looked at before any more development takes place throughout the Vale, because this is we've got untreated sewerage and risk of going into the sea, into rivers, and it's all part of the same system that needs to be looked into. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mike, I'm assuming you'd like me to answer that again.
Carry on, Clive. You're doing a job.
Yes. Thank you, Councillor. In terms of foul sewerage, any new development, Welsh Water, the regulator, so they would assess the foul network serving that area, whether there's capacity or whether improvements are necessary to facilitate larger developments in the area. And that also will link back into these DWMPs, the drainage water management plans that wastewater management plans that Welsh Water are developing. for new developments, it's not permitted to connect surface water into foul systems anymore, so you won't have new combined networks. So in terms of making things worse, new developments shouldn't be putting surface water into systems where there's foul sewage already. There may be exceptions where it's not possible to do alternatives. There's a hierarchy within the SUD standards that allow developers to sort of look at a discharge point, and if there's an existing combined sewer and no alternative, they may be able to put it in there. But before they can put it in as a SAB, we would also require that they treat that water and also look to reduce the volume going in, because most of the water getting into the system actually is going in under the lower magnitude rainfall events. So the first sort of 5 mil of rainfall is often sort of quoted. So putting softer measures at the surface, rain gardens, bioretention areas, green roofs. We've got one of those hopefully coming in on the waste transfer station. Those under light rainfall allow rain to fall, be through evapotranspiration. It either evaporates off or it's transpired through the plants. So you can reduce the load onto the sewage network as well, which is why Welsh Water are quite keen on such features properly considered and implemented. And as a SAB, Welsh Water are a statutory consultee to us, so the foul system and connections will be dealt through the planning process, but anything to do with surface water and flood risk as a result of that will be dealt through us as a SAB, or in conjunction potentially with some of the flooding issues through TAM 15 in the planning process. The SAB process, if we have an existing flooding issue, we would, as a lead local flood authority, we would comment on that to the through planning and ensure that that was considered properly by the developer. Unfortunately, at present, it's hard for us to sort of compel a new development to try and fix all the problems downstream. If that's as a result of the whole of Penarth being developed, it's very difficult to try and fix it with a smaller development than the existing sort of urban area. However, with the update of TAM 15 that's coming through from Welsh Government and the resulting sort of updates and guidance from Welsh Water, from Natural Resources Wales, we look to update how we sort of consider those developments, and whether we may be able to implement things like critical drainage areas, where if we know we've got existing flooding areas, we can actually ask for betterment from new developments because we have concerns, hotspots, as other people alluded to, in certain areas. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions or comments from members? Okay, well, I have a couple of questions then. Firstly, it touches on what Councillor Norman was saying about development, and I won't go into the specifics, but Mike will be aware of various examples within my own ward that I've sent to him, and it's basically a broad point in terms of having confidence in the planning process. There's a development in my own ward called Cannon Walk, and it's located directly adjacent to the playing fields just off Lewis Road. So that's for background for other members. And when Cannon Walk went through the planning system, the flood risk was, for some reason or another, not spotted, and at the back end of last year we had a situation where residents' gardens flooded and their properties were at risk, and we now have issues on the playing fields that have required rather large bunds having to be dug to prevent that flood risk. And there's a separate issue on Landock Hill within my own ward that I've raised with Mike, and the council are working with Welsh Water to get to the bottom of the cause of that. But the reason I raise this is because a planning application has gone in at the very bottom of that hill for a development of around 130 dwellings, and that land, it is green space. Admittedly, it's overgrown and isn't as well used as other green spaces within the area. But touching on what Councillor Wilson said about sort of tarmacking of hard standings and the impacts that can have on drainage, it's really a point about having confidence in the planning process so that these concerns are raised at the outset and are dealt with, because when we had the issue with Cannon Walk, that wasn't spotted and it's led to flooding. So it's a question for you guys really, and I appreciate you're not planners, but how can we have confidence that those concerns will be raised and that basically we're not going to have a situation at the bottom of Landock Hill like we've now got in Cannon Walk if planning, and I use the word if on there because the application has gone in, but it hasn't been determined that planning were granted on that site.
I think I'm going to ask Clive to update you on this, Chair, because he's very familiar with this area and with the ongoing arguments regarding concerns over potential flooding with both Cannon Walk and the site you referred to at the bottom of Landock Hill. So, Clive, I'll let you run through some of the details.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Obviously, I won't dwell too much on the details of some of those because it obviously relates to specific properties. Yep. But I am aware of the issues at Cannon Walk and further down the catchment on Landock Hill. I think with regard to the new development to the, which way would it be? Southeast of Landock Hill, or the other side from the existing 5 properties. That development, although it it may not have gone through planning, but we have been consulted on that site. We've been consulted as a SAB and also as the lead local flood authority. Some of the flooding issues we undertake sort of active liaison with the planners now since we've become the SUDS approval body. It's a completely separate system to the planning system, so developers have to demonstrate to us that they can sustainably drain that site. So even if it looks like it's very hard and you know, lots of roads and houses, they will have had to comply with the statutory standards controlling the volume of water running off. The discharge point has to be acceptable, as well as water quality, amenity, biodiversity, and the sustainability of the system. We actually have to take on, as a SUDS approval body, any assets serving more than 2 properties. There's a mandatory adoption clause, so those assets will actually pass to the council as a SUDS approving body to manage in perpetuity. So we have skin in the game. We're invested in this process. We don't want to see flooding anyway. So we have liaised with the developer. We have ensured that they've considered the catchment draining onto the site as well as just the catchment within the site itself. So it's not just the rainfall that falls on the site, it's also looking upslope and saying what kind of area drains down to here. If developers could, looking at any site, if a developer can demonstrate there's a very big system that adequately drains an area and moves it away from their site, then it may be appropriate to take that into account. Otherwise, we tend to start with the national surface water flood maps and sort of say, well, if it indicates there are flow paths across the site, you need to look carefully at this to make sure that those flows can be managed across the site safely. So a lot of the new developments, you'll see flow paths, exceedance flow paths down through site. So you'll have green spaces, corridors for water to flow. Those may be to deal with the water that actually is sort of generated on site from the new properties and roads. And it also may be to allow flows across the site if there are known flow paths. We like I say, there's no obligation on landowners higher up on a hillside to hold all water back and stop it from going on down slope, but through the SAB process and also as an LLFA consultee through the planning process and TAM 15, we do make sure that developers consider how those potential flows will be managed. I think Cannon Walk, I would much prefer that the flow path through the back gardens that are affected there didn't exist. I would note that it was picked up at the time and I was involved at the time with the developer, but because of the way that was considered, it was deemed acceptable by the developer to use rear gardens as a potential flow path for a higher magnitude event. Now, unfortunately, we've had a couple of events that have triggered this, and I would question that they are that high magnitude, so something's not working. As a council, with land holdings above a site, there was no problem before the houses were built, but as a council, obviously, we're aware that we sort of there's some responsibility to sort of do our best for the public, and where we have a number of properties impacted, members of my team are actively surveying other systems in the area and trying to develop alternative solutions to try and convey as much water away from the new development as possible. And we're also liaising with the developer as well about that. So I can't go into too much detail, but we are, although that area won't trigger a Section 19 report because there was fortunately no internal property flooding. Obviously, it did have an impact on back gardens and sort of the wider area. We are aware of that, and just because it hasn't got a Section 19 report doesn't mean we're not looking at it. And the bunds in the fields, although they will help the situation, if you put a very large magnitude event down that catchment, they won't capture everything and hold it. It's just not feasible. They will be overtopped at some point, and that's why we're looking at alternative or additional solutions to try and convey more water around properties, either underground through culverts or overground through sort of flow paths down highways or open spaces wherever it's possible. As you'll know, in that area, it's quite challenging to find a route to get it past houses now and away. And also in that area, we're now dealing with most of the surface water sewers are vested in Welsh Water. So you've also got Welsh Water involvement if we want to tap into a system. So it's not simply put a bund and it will solve it. Much as I wish it did, there will always be a residual risk if you're in a valley. You know, if you have a big enough storm, the water will flow down the low, you know, the bottom of the valley. So we are actively considering the Cannon Walk site and the sort of the wider flood risk in that area, and also Landock Hill, because what we can't do is pass those flows on more rapidly around one site and then cause flooding further down the hillside. And if we solve the problem at Landock Hill by saying we'll have a bigger pipe and push it on further down, we may have flooding lower down on Penarth Road in front of the Porsche garage or other areas where we've had flooding previously. So rather than chase our tail, we are considering this. We will look at it. There are predictions. We can sort of look at what kind of magnitude storms generate how much water, where does it go, and we're taking that and surveys of the existing system to try and work out what are our options for moving water around to try and help alleviate the flood risk. But it does come back to ultimately if you're in a house that's identified in the National Surface Water Flood Risk sort of mapping as being at risk, it's probably because you're in a depression or a low spot. I would advocate that anyone puts in place a sort of an emergency plan or a flood plan, because whilst I'd rather it didn't happen, I'd rather if it happens in the dark, people know what to do. With surface water flooding, it's unlikely to get to a depth where it's it's not going to be chest high, hopefully, in most areas, whereas river flooding, there is the potential for quite significant depths of water, and I'd much rather people know about this risk and then also think, well, even if the council or someone else can undertake engineering works to try and help the situation, you also need to think, well, what's the worst case scenario if I do need to leave my home or try and protect my home? What can I do and prepare in advance?
Okay, thank you for that, Clive. Do we have any further questions from members? I can't see any. If we move on to the recommendations then, which are to note the position of the corporate lists from Quarter A and refer comments as appropriate. And thank you, Mike and Clive, for your time this evening. Really appreciate it. If we move on then to the next item, which is the draft annual governance statement.
Okay, thank you, Chair. This is me. So what you have in front of you tonight is the draft annual governance statement. The statement reviews the internal controls and governance arrangements within the local authority. It's drafted as part of our suite of documents for the statement of accounts and was actually presented in draft format to Audit Wales at the end of June. So the draft statement is there for you in Appendix A to the report that you've got. The format of the report is the same as it has been in the last few years, so there are no changes there. The main additions really within that report tonight refer to COVID, which obviously had a significant impact during the year in which this report is looking at. Really, the impact as far as the annual governance statement is concerned is that reporting arrangements for the council obviously changed during the year. And you'll remember, if we go back to April, May of last year, the suspension of formal meetings such as cabinet and scrutiny. We had changes to some key services which are detailed in the report for you, but just very briefly, we obviously opened up hubs for children of key workers and vulnerable children, and at the same time we closed some of the services that we're known for running, such as things like our library service and our parks. And another key change to the way we operate was that where they could, the vast proportion of our staff moved to work from home. So all of these have had an impact really on the governance arrangements within the authority. And what the authority did to try and address some of those was we moved to the use of the managing director's emergency powers, and these were reported to members on a regular basis. So although we didn't have meetings, members were aware of the decisions that were being made. We also had very regular management team meetings, so you'll see detailed in the statement that certainly for a considerable length of time early in the pandemic, the management team was meeting on a daily basis, and the leader and the deputy leader were involved in all of those meetings. And another area, I suppose, around governance was you'll be aware that the council received significant funding from Welsh Government during the year, whether that was to meet additional costs, expenditure that we incurred to offset our loss of income, but obviously we administered significant sums of money by way of business grants. All of those have governance issues and risk issues attached to them. And I suppose it's important to point out, it is said in the report that we are now moving obviously into recovery phase, but we may well not recover to the same position that we were in before. Some services have changed and may not go back to where they were before. So for the report is flagging up for you that from a governance perspective, this is an ongoing issue really. The report does cover the normal things which you've seen previously around complaints and whistleblowing, both of which are separate items on this agenda tonight, and also talks about some of the engagement work that has gone on both within the council, and Tracy's already mentioned the work that we've done with staff, but also engagement work external. So a key element of good governance is how the authority manages risk. And you'll see in the report it's referenced that internal audit have looked at this during the course of the year and have given reasonable assurance in relation to the management of risk across the authority during the period that the report is talking about. And the head of internal audit has given an annual opinion on the controls framework to say that he has given reasonable assurance based on the work that has been done during the year. So at the end, we list the significant governance issues. One is obviously COVID-19 and the effect that it's had on our control environment. But as reported, we're saying that despite those changes that I've outlined, the effect on the internal control environment has not been significant at all. So this report, Chair, was submitted to Audit Wales, as I said, at the end of June. It's now subject to review by themselves as part of their annual audit of the accounts. I remind members that this remains a live document now until the accounts are signed off. And any issues that occur between now and that time that have governance implications will need to be reflected in any revised version of this report. We will bring the final version to you when we bring the final audited statement of accounts, and we're intending to do that by the end of September. So that's just an overview of the report, Chair. I'm obviously happy to take any questions or queries that people may have.
Thank you for that, Carys. Councillor Wilson.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Carys. And can you also thank the team for all their work on this, because I know there's an awful lot of effort in this, and I know with subsequent reports as well coming to tonight. But there are a couple of issues. The first one is obviously future-proofing things going forward in terms of governance. We've got this new legislation that's going to have an impact upon the way the council works and works with other parties as well. And I just want sort of an assurance there that the governance statement can reflect the future as well as it is today. I think that's an important issue, and I know there's a review of senior management. I want to dwell too much into that because I know it could affect some of you, officers in particular. I was thinking, as well as obviously members and the way that they deal with people. And I just wondered, perhaps, in the governance of that, we've got the CMT working together. Obviously, we may need to be looking at how the CMT works in the future, especially in relation to my first point about the future arrangements in terms of these new committees that are going to be set up. I'll be grateful for your thoughts on that, Carys.
I think those are relevant points, actually, Councillor Wilson. We do talk about one of the ongoing pressures is going to be around finances, and that although we've had funding to support us through the last 16, 17 months from, to support us with our additional costs, we are flagging up in this that there is there could be an ongoing issue beyond this year. So I think really what you just raised probably comes within the same bracket, which is maybe something we have to do. I wouldn't say they're significant governance issues, but they are things that we need to be mindful of, and we need to review as and when things change to make sure that our control and risk systems are actually reflecting and ensure that actually they're managed as well as they can be. So I mean, from that point of view, I am quite happy to take that away as something that we need to include in the report for looking forward.
Can I just come back on that, Chair? Just briefly, thank you very much for that, Carys, because I think some of these issues, especially about the big committees where we've got to work with other councils, there is a higher risk factor in some respects because we won't be in control of everything that's going on. And although we can have an input, I think what we got to discuss with Audit Wales is that kind of accountability aspect, accountability to our residents, but also how does this wider body be accountable to its own constituents as well? I think that's a major issue, because if we have to spend money beyond our own area, as it were, as part of the regional partnership, I would say, approach, then really, you know, we got to provide that kind of dialogue, and we also got to make sure there are controls on that, so that our electorate are satisfied that things are not going to run away. And I think that's going to be a big issue, especially with the kind of accountability that is being set up at the moment. I mean, we don't even know about the scrutiny function at the moment on this. We know that in terms of the legislation, it does say, the new legislation, which I know is being consulted on, that audit and governance may be a minimum of once a year on this. But it is an issue that we do need to explore, especially with Audit Wales.
Before I go back to Caris, I think that Debbie's got a hand up on that.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to also just comment, and I know Caris is heavily involved in this, and it was to give assurance to the committee that with regards to the new legislation, so the Local Government and Elections Wales Act, we have, as you know, taken quite a significant report to Cabinet previously and to scrutiny committee, and shared an action plan that we're working to, and as officers, we in the main we do meet on a fortnightly basis, so that we are cited on those provisions. We're also conscious, as Councillor Wilson has alluded to, that we've got a further consultation to come out with regards to CJCs. That'll be picked up at our next meeting. So it's just to give that assurance that behind the scenes, senior officers are certainly cited on these provisions, and also working to that action plan and developing it.
Fine, thank you.
Caris, did you want to come back on any of that?
No, I think just to repeat actually and support what Debbie has just said, and I think it is worth us making just a reference to that within the governance statement. As I said, it's still live, so that's a point we can take away and look at inputting before we finalise the document.
Okay, if we could, that would be great. Do any other members wish to speak on this? I don't see anyone, so with that in mind, if we move on to the recommendation that the annual governance statement be recommended to the Cabinet, to the Leader and Managing Director for adoption, do I have a seconder for that, please?
Second.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Are we all agreed on that? Perfect. If we then move on to item 8, the Corporate Complaints Annual Report.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to pick that one up if I can. So tonight we're presenting our 7th annual report under the current Annual Concerns and Complaints Policy. And as the report states, committee in the Local Government Elections Wales Act 2021, committee is required to review and assess the authority's ability to handle complaints effectively. So we're asking committee to note the content of the report and pass or refer on to refer the report and any comments on the Cabinet for consideration. So the report focuses on complaints handled through the Corporate Concerns and Complaints Policy, but includes some information on social services complaints and complaints received from the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales, just to complete the picture. And our policy, which complies with the Ombudsman's model policy, is designed to ensure that all our residents have equal access to the complaints process and that complainants get a consistent and fair response to their complaints. It's worth saying that an analysis of our complaints can contribute to the Council's understanding of how satisfied with the way our customers are with the way our services are delivered, the way in which we manage complaints, and equally provides an opportunity to learn how we can improve access to and delivery of services. And in the report this year, in Appendix 4, following feedback from committee previously, we have, for the first time, included a small number of randomly selected case studies from the complaints we received during the year. And it would be interesting to hear some feedback on how those are presented, actually. So the report contains lots of statistics, lots of trends, but I think the key story here is that the Council, based on the information we have, continues to meet citizens' expectations in terms of their experience of accessing and receiving services, how we investigate complaints. However, we could be doing more with complaints to develop customer insight, ensuring that our services continue to meet expectations of our residents going forward. And just covering off a few quick points. So the volume of corporate complaints received during 2021 was significantly lower than previous year. So we received 338 complaints. It's also lower than the kind of the annual average, which is around 387. So given this and the previous upward trend in complaint volumes, it's likely that the coronavirus pandemic had a suppressing effect on complaint volumes during the year under review. Whether that's as a result of a reduction in the number of services we've provided or increased goodwill and understanding from residents during a very difficult time, it's very difficult to say. Even so, the total number of complaints received represents a very small percentage of the services we've provided during the year, suggesting that, generally speaking, service delivery matches residents' expectations. Environment and housing continue to generate the higher number of complaints. I think they generated 270 for the year. Still a small proportion when compared to the total number of individual service interactions with residents during the year, and given the changes to waste and recycling collections arrangements in Barry during the autumn of 2020. So the long-term trend for the Council of not complying with our 10 to 20 day response targets continued, and in fact it dropped again this year to 64.2%. Worth saying that we haven't received any complaints regarding the time it's taken to investigate, which kind of suggests the customers are more, residents are more concerned about the outcome and making sure that they're properly investigated rather than sticking strictly to the deadline. However, the Ombudsman is very keen to be looking at this area and has started to collect data on a quarterly basis. So it's something we should be concerned about. The fact that around 90% of complainants decide not to escalate beyond stage 1 of the policy is a good indication that, generally speaking, they're happy with the way that complaints are investigated, that the outcomes are fair, and also that the timescales that they're dealt in, as I said. I wanted to point out as well that there's a long-term trend of underreporting of both the causes and learning from complaints. Learning was recorded against only 14% of complaints and 38% identified a cause. And the fact that around 65% of complaints were upheld in part or in full suggests that there are probably lessons to be learned there. And that's something which we definitely need to work on in the future, and we have opportunities to do that. We're continuing to meet the requirements of statutory bodies, so we received 38 complaints via the Ombudsman. They only took 1 into investigation, and although that's a slight increase in the previous year, when taking population into consideration, it's broadly where we should be as an authority, or where the Ombudsman would expect us to be, might be a better way of saying it. I said at the beginning that we really want to make sure that our complaints process is accessible for everyone, and we introduced an online form for capturing equalities information. Unfortunately, we only had 20 responses during the year, so really difficult to draw any conclusions from that information, although we have included it in the report And again, that's something which we definitely want to improve on going forward. And as part of our overall improvement plan, customer relations has just begun to implement a new digital customer experience platform with significantly improved functionality for engaging with our citizens. And part of the initial implementation of that software between now and Christmas will be a review and a redesign of the complaints process. And that effort will be focused on improving response times and collecting and analysing what's been learned from complaints, and so we can develop better insight and use that to improve our services. And I think I'd like to leave it there, actually. So happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you for that, Tony. I can see a couple of members have raised their hands, so I will take them in order. I would just plead, we've still got quite a lot to get through, and appreciate it's a hot evening, so could we all be relatively brief with our questions, please? I'll go first to Councillor Wilson.
Yep, okay, I will be brief. I think some of the areas where people make complaints is about expectations. And I think we've got to be very specific about expectations when dealing with the public. Like if we say something's got to be resolved in 3 days, then it takes 4 or 5 days, it's going to lead to complaint. So I think expectations is key. I think in terms of your other point about getting equalities data and whatever, I think there's ways of doing that. I mean, obviously, I know I've asked for a report that you may be aware, Tony, in the autumn for corporate resources about the work of the contact centre and the new technologies moving on that. But I think there's a plea here is that perhaps when we develop our apps, develop our systems, that we do trying to really nudge people to fill in equalities information. I think that is really, really crucial, as well as when people make complaints that we try to identify, because what we've got to try and do is to make sure that people with protected characteristics don't feel that they're being put upon or discriminated against, as it were. So they're treated the same as everyone else. And also we've got to look at to make up the Velcro organ to reflect that. But those are my points.
Thank you for that, Councillor Wilson. If I move on to Councillor McCaffer, then Councillor Rowlands, and then I'll leave Tony to address the points raised.
Thank you, Chair. Hi, Tony. Nice to see you. I just wanted to clarify, maybe I'm reading this wrong. On page 5, it says about the number of complaints that didn't have the cause of the complaint recorded. I'm kind of intrigued as to why the cause of any complaint wouldn't be in some way recorded, because that is then going to affect your ability to learn because you don't know what the complaint was. Am I misreading it?
Unfortunately, not. So the way we currently record things on our existing Oracle CRM platform is that the complaint record relates to the service which the complaint is about. So it might be waste management, it might be any service. So that tells us the broad area. But then in terms of what caused that complaint, so is it a staffing issue? Did we fail to meet our service standards? Did we fail to communicate with the customer properly? That is captured by the complaint owner when the complaint is closed down. Unfortunately, not everybody completes that information, and that's the same with the learning from complaints. So with our new digital platform which we're implementing, we've got a great opportunity to change the way that information is captured and maybe make some bits of it mandatory, and make it a much more kind of in a much more reportable format. So that's one of the things we're aiming to do when we review the end-to-end complaints process as part of that work.
Okay, sorry, can I just quickly come back? So when you say the complaint owner, are you referring to the call handler or the person or the officer that the complaint is lodged against? Who is the complaint's owner? The person undertaking the complaint investigation. Right, okay. Right. You understand why I'm a little bit concerned, because if we don't know what they're complaining about, how are we ever going to be any better?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's
So
a big area for improvement.
We're saying it's to do with how we're actually storing and taking hold of the complaint. Is that what we're saying realistically?
It's to do with officers recording, because the ability or the capability to record the information is there. It can be made mandatory within our existing CRM platform. With our new platform, we've got the potential to make it a mandatory field so that the complaint can't be closed down without that being recorded. So that's something which we're aiming to do going forward. Okay, so again, officers, do you mean officers in the, let's use C1B for example, if people are calling in to complain, is it those officers, or are you talking about the officers the complaint is pushed onto? It's the officers who investigate the complaint and respond to the customer. Right, okay, so that could be within any directorate at all then? Yes, that's correct. Wow, that's a really big task you've got ahead of you there, because we absolutely need to nail down what people are complaining for to be able to learn from it. Yeah, absolutely, and it is a big job, but I think that as I say, with the new software and the ability to make those fields mandatory, yes. So even if you force people to say unidentified or something, then at least they're thinking about it and completing something. Yeah, well, something has to be said, because clearly someone rings or contacts and the first thing they're going to tell you is what the complaint is. Yeah. And the first thing we're going to do is not write that down anywhere. Yeah. That doesn't, okay. All right, well, as long as you've got some way of dealing with this and making it more efficient, because I'm really concerned about that, because we can't improve if we don't know what's going on. So just to be 100% clear, so when we log the complaint, the information that the customer gives us about what they think went wrong, that is all captured on the complaint. When the complaint is then closed down, we need to capture, until the investigation is complete, we don't necessarily know exactly why the complaint has happened. So the customer might say, you didn't deliver the service that you said within the timescales. Well, yeah, okay, we've breached our timescales, but actually the reason for that may have been that the process broke down somewhere, or that a staff member didn't do something that they should have done. And those are the key details we want to be able to identify and capture in an aggregated way. And currently, that's the bit that we're missing, largely. One more, Chair. Anything you need us to do to help you get that in place needs to be done. We need to make sure that we know what people are complaining about so we can move forward and stop that being able to happen. And we need to have a way to report it in here, because it just doesn't look like we're being as efficient as I know we are. Yeah. And I feel sorry for you, Tony, because you're here delivering this to us, but it's not actually you or your team, now I understand more, that are actually producing this data for you. So anything you need, just let us know. Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers for that, Tony. Councillor Golans.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief because Catherine had already asked the question I wanted to ask about the non-recorded, but I'm deeply concerned as well. But as someone who used to work in a call centre, I know how difficult it is to try and capture all the information coming in. And as Catherine has already said, if there's anything we could do to help and support you in that sort of way, I'm more than happy to call on my call centre days to help you.
Thank you, that's very much appreciated.
Okay, thank you for that. I can't see any further hands raised from members, so if we move on to the recommendations, firstly to note the contents of the report, that we continue to receive an annual update, and that we refer the report to Cabinet for their consideration. Could I have a seconder, please, on that? Nothing particularly controversial there.
Second that, Chair.
Thank you, Vice Chair, and of course refer all of the comments raised by members to Cabinet as well. If we move on then to the next item, which is the unaudited statement of accounts.
Thank you, Chair. I'm taking that this year as Gemma's on leave this week, so hopefully I'll stand in adequately for her. I'd just like to briefly run through the major changes this year, which are highlighted in the supplementary information that was already circulated to you. There's just a few key points that are a little bit different this year, so we just would like to run through them and highlight them to you. It was a challenging year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, funding was provided by Welsh Government via several new grants. This is detailed in note 15 of the accounts. Some of the grants covered additional expenditure which were incurred by us as part of the service, and others were loss of income that the council had. So we had funding from Welsh Government for those items. Now, these grants, as I say, covered us for the cost of additional services that we provided and are included in the cost of service in the income and expenditure account. However, the council also received grant funding which was distributed on behalf of Welsh Government, and they were non-council services. So, for example, there's a whole list of them in the note, but for example, there was the business support grant and there was say the £500 payment to care workers. So these are not included in the cost of service of the accounts, as we administered these grants on an agency basis on behalf of Welsh Government. The funding, however, that was due to us or repayable at year end is included in the balance sheet as a debtor or creditor figure. Another point that's different this year, you may have noticed, is the accounts are a lot bigger, and we've had to put in this year a set of group accounts. So this is because we have to have included this year the Big Fresh catering company. Now, the catering company was established on the 1st of January 2020, and the 2021 accounts include the whole 15 months period of trading for that company. Their accounts have been prepared by an external accountant, and they've also been audited by an external accountant, so we weren't involved in that process. However, what we've had to do is consolidate those accounts into ours, and what we've done is we've taken out any intercompany balance, any intercompany transfers and balances out of the accounts that we've produced. And what will happen is later on in the year, I think in September, the Learning and Culture Scrutiny Committee will be presented with the annual report of the catering company. Another item that was quite different this year was the council received a lot of PPE due to the pandemic, which came from the joint equipment store, and we actually received these items free of charge. Now, some of these items were used by the council, and some of them we received to distribute on to external providers of both care homes and domiciliary providers. So the elements of the items used by the council are to be included in the cost of service and in the balance sheet. And what we have to do is net off the expenditure as a notional grant. Now, the stock relating to the external providers has been included in the balance sheet at year end, but we shouldn't have included this figure. We need to exclude that figure. So going forward, when we produce the audited version of the accounts and which will be presented to committee in September, that will be removed. The other problem we've had with the PPE is that the items weren't actually purchased by the council, so we didn't actually know how much they cost to actually purchase. So we've been trying to ascertain the appropriate unit cost to value the stock. So we had received one figure, but since the accounts have been produced, we've been advised of an updated figure that we need to include. So the stock figure will be recalculated again in the final audited version of accounts to reflect that. And also what we're trying to ensure is this consistency across all authorities who had the same stock from the joint equipment store. So there's a piece of work that's happening, and we're in consultation with Audit Wales regarding that as well. Just a bit of an update. So with regard to the valuations this year, there's been no major group of assets that were valued. You may remember that last year, due to the uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic, a material uncertainty statement was included in the accounts relating to the valuation of the land and buildings. However, the valuers have now confirmed that the uncertainty clause is no longer required, and the valuations carried out in 1920 don't need to be revised. So that was some good news that we had, that we didn't have to change that. There's one other major change which has required the 1920 accounts to be restated, and that was relating to pensions. So the Joint Committee are not classed as separate employers in the pension fund. However, for accounting purposes, in order to produce separate accounts, the assets and liabilities have to be split. So the data had been rolled forward from the inception of the joint committees, and it was decided that we probably needed to carry out a full review. You know, we'd been going on that basis for a few years. We needed to carry out a sort of a full review to give a more accurate picture of what the current position was on the respective splits. So this was carried out during the year, and more data was provided to the actuary relating to actual staff who left and actual starters for the period, so they were able to calculate the position more accurately. And what this has done is this resulted in an increase in the liability for the joint committees. So as I say, what we had to do is we have restated the accounts for 1920 as well, because it was deemed to be material. You'll also note that this year the pension notes have also increased in the statement, because what we've actually done is instead of just putting in one figure for the pension figures, we've actually split them over the joint committees. So actually, in each table you'll see the Vale, you'll see the SRS, you'll see the adoption. So again, it's provided more detail that we felt was probably necessary to show the reader the accounts. Part of the report as well has also brought to you tonight the SRS accounts and the annual return for the adoption service. So it's for information for you. Both accounts have been presented to the respective joint committees and approved by those committees. Again, this year you'll see the SRS accounts have been streamlined. The narrative report is a lot shorter, and we've taken out some of the tables. So hopefully that's a sort of a shorter report to look at, which is more concise and to the point. Again, the only major change there will be the pensions, as I said, because we've split it out more accurately. And the adoption service has a small annual return because they're less than 2.5 million. They only have to do a sort of a smaller annual return. So that's obviously a lot less detail in there than a full set of accounts. So that was just a quick run through of sort of, as I say, the major changes that have happened this year, but I'm happy to see if I can take any questions from you.
Well, thank you for that, Carol. Do we have any questions or comments? Councillor Johnson and then Councillor Wilson.
If Mark wants to go first, then no.
I'm happy to go first, if that's okay. Thank you, Councillor Johnson. And thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm just going on to page 116 of the annual accounts in terms of pension liability. And what I'm quite concerned about is the big increase in pension liability in terms of our dominant pension scheme. And I just wondered, this is the available and council pension scheme, funded and unfunded. We're going up from 252 million to 321 million. And that's almost an increase of £70 million. Mm-hmm. Now, I know it's been well known that, you know, we've produced an increase in our reserves, but if we got an increase in liability of 70 million, surely that is some big issue that we do need to consider and think about. And I'm just wondering, perhaps, what sort of discussions have we had with other local authorities, because maybe they're facing similar issues?
Yeah, I think it probably is a common issue, because I probably think, you know, because it's the pension fund is across Cardiff and the Vale. There's many employers in there, so it does fluctuate, and it does change, and you know it does increase. But I think what usually happens is that when we have our triennial review, we will discuss with the actuaries what is an appropriate rate that we should actually contribute to be clawing back any of those the liabilities. So obviously it's I think most accounts of councils you'll see will have a large liability, but usually I think on when we do the triennial review, that's when we actually have the discussion with the actuaries to set our rate that they feel and we feel is appropriate.
Can I come back to that?
Yeah, you can. Yeah.
I'm just, obviously you do have, so you think this is basically on the actuary's assessment of our liabilities, really, and really we should keep a watching brief on this, rather than do any sort of action to try and mitigate this issue.
Yes, I think that's what, as I say, generally happens. It's a liability that's there, and as I say, it is, they are large figures. But as I say, I think probably if you look at other authorities' accounts, they will have similarly large figures. But it's not that we ignore it. We do review it, and we will change our contribution rates. I say regular, so it's every 3 years, to actually make it a dent or something that's appropriate. And as I say, the actuary will make a recommendation, and we will discuss it with them.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Councillor Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thanks, Mark, as well for that. And I think the thing that I think bothers us, or bothers me, is when you see such large fluctuations between one year and the next, and obviously, which is natural within the actuarial world and the pensions liabilities and that, but it always looks very strange that we can be sat there discussing pennies in other places, and then you just see a £70 million change. In a note, well into the papers. Obviously, we know that last year was a very complex year for working out where money was going, how it was being spent, etc. And we had a lot of discussion at last week's corporate performance and resources, to discuss, sort of how that had gone through the books. I just wanted to really obviously this is a very big agenda, this is a big item, but some quick clarifications, if Carolyn can help. Page 63, which is note 25.
Yeah.
There's reference to something which is called long-term. Because I feel fairly familiar with what's going on in most of the accounts, but there's a reference here to long-term receipts in advance, including commuted sums and S278 contributions. I don't know what section 278 contributions are, and I can't see an explanation within the document. And then in the note below, which is note 26, useful reserves, there's reference to capital grants unapplied account. There is a note elsewhere that says a bit sort of QED that's an account for capital grants which are unapplied. But I'm just looking for a bit of information on what section 278 means and what the capital grants unapplied account is. And one third point is page 69, which is officers remunerated in excess of £60,000. There's a figure given for 2019-20, and then some figures given for 2020-21. And I was looking to clarify that they are counting the same things. Because the 2019-20 total number of employees, and if Karen's got in front of her, has a total of 72, and then the total number of employees for the following year is 95. And so obviously they've been split up for the current year in terms of teaching employees and non-teaching employees, so that because we've asked that in previous years to get an understanding of what, say, because people weren't sure what was a teaching member of staff, what was a council officer, as it were. But I'm just trying to get my head around the 72 to 95 jump within 12 months when we've had so much going on. I'm not quite sure where that's come from, whether that needs to just be double checked. I know then the big fresh makes it to 96 later on, which then is confusing again, but just trying to understand 72 to 95.
Yeah.
So.
If I do that one first, because I've got on screen. I mean, we can do some analysis, but I think probably what you'll find is that it depends where people are in the bands, really, because if you've got a lot of staff, say, I'm just going to go on the 60 to 65. If you've got a lot of staff that perhaps last year, or a range of staff, say, that were on sort of 59, they wouldn't be in there, obviously last year, and perhaps pay rise, small pay rise, might just.
I appreciate the cliff edge argument. I think it's probably better just if someone could double check that those figures are right.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We can go through it, and if you want to see the previous year split as well in teaching, we can actually do that. But yeah, we can do that for you. But as I say, I think there's sort of like a bit of step in there, isn't it? It takes a while, but we can do that. I mean, well, how would you?
I'm just a note. I don't know whether when it's coming back to us later on, or just a note to explain whatever the chair's happy with. If it was a couple of people, if it was 72 to 75 or 77, then I'd accept a sort of an inflationary cliff edge. That a lot of people have moved up a scale a point or two, but an increase from 72 to 95. Doesn't make sense to me in the way that it's presented.
Okay, that's fine. As I say, and if it might be easier, if it's easier to sort of present it where we actually split the teachers over the 2 years, we can do that split as well. And also then going back to section 278 and the commuted maintenance, we do receive payments. So again, if you want a breakdown of what these are, I can get you the breakdown. But I know sections 278, I think, are sort of like I think they're like perhaps planning or highways type things, agreements, where we would hold things, I think, for commuted sums pending future work being undertaken. So if you'd like, I can give you a split of those going forward, just so, and put a note of perhaps an explanation under it.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm less interested in that's my own phrase, but it's less sort of the detail of it. It's understanding exactly what it is, so that when somebody can look this up and goes, what is section 278 contribution, at least you can find an explanation somewhere within the document. Yeah,
that's fine. We can check, we can put a note underneath. And again, with capital grants then applied, we will receive capital grants. And if sometimes we have it's sort of like granted in advance. Again, we've had the grant, but we haven't actually incurred the expenditure, so we will carry it forward. It won't be applied. We class it as applied when it's matched against the actual expenditure. So again, if it's unapplied, we're carrying it forward for future, to netten off future expenditure. So again, if you'd like, we can put a little note underneath as well, just to sort of give you a better explanation there.
Yeah, perhaps unpack it somewhere within the explanations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I see that Debbie and then Rachel would like to come in on that.
Very, very briefly, I was just going to say section 278 is a highways related matter, so I can certainly feed that through to Carolyn, and we can pick that up in reports going forward and get an email out to members, just so you've got the detail.
Rachel.
Yeah, it was just to say on the.
So we've got a few sound issues there. I'm not sure whether it's something covering your mic or something.
Can you
you're not
hang on.
Let me try without my headphones. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's better.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to make a point on the officers remunerated over 60,000. We do consider that table as being material by nature as part of the remuneration disclosures. So we actually apply a lower materiality threshold to that table and audit it in detail. So we will provide assurance over the number of officers included in that. So I just wondered whether you'd be happy just for, I guess, our assurance to cover that off rather than Carolyn doing some additional work. So yeah, just an offer and an explanation, I guess, of the work we do on that.
I think really it's where I'm aware that there are members of the public who will pick up this document and will look at that table and will wonder how the Vale Council has gone from 72 in 1 year, over 60,000 to 95 a year later, and then that will lead to probably more questions and possibly some slightly hot-headed remarks. So I think if it just needs to be unpacked that those figures are related to the same or not, and I think it would be easier if it's in the next iteration of this document to show that people can see the comparison from 1 year to the next and that those are the same things. Just because 23 additional employees above the the cliff edge threshold for noting it seems like a lot. So I mean, we're being asked for comments. That's a comment.
Can I just come in on that, Chair, if that's okay? I'm just going to say I would echo that. I think one of the things that people do see in the annual report and accounts, not just public sector organisations but private ones, is what the remuneration of senior members of staff are. And I think you're absolutely right. We've got to get that right. And if we need an explanation, then we need an explanation. And I think if it is cliff edge stats, fine. If we have to split it for the previous year in terms of teaching, non-teaching, I think that's also good as well, because I think that would be helpful. But I think people do need to get that context, because I do think a lot of people, if they see the accounts, that is one area they're going to look at and focus on. So
thank you for that, Mark. Do we have any other questions or comments? Okay, if we move on to the recommendations then. Firstly, that we review the accounts and refer them to the head of finance for further discussion with the external auditors, that the unaudited joint committee shared regulatory services statement of accounts and the shared regulatory services annual governance statement are provided for information, and that the annual return is provided for information, and any comments of the committee passed forward for referral. That's recommendations 1, 2 and 3. I thought I'd save time by not reading them out in their entirety. Have we got a seconder for that?
I'm happy to second that.
Fantastic. I think that's agreed unanimously. If we move on then to the whistleblowing update.
Lovely, thank you, Chair. That's my report. Just by way of an update, before I move on to highlight some of the key points, pleased to say that at Cabinet yesterday, the policy and procedures which are set out at Appendix B to the report were presented to Cabinet, and they were agreed for implementation with effect from the 1st of September, that being the date when the Speak Out line will be launched. So pleased to update the Governance and Audit Committee in that regard. As you'll recall, the draft report previously came to committee prior to Tracy consulting our trade union colleagues, and the recommendation from the committee was to incorporate some flowcharts, which I know Tracy has taken on board, and they have been reflected in the policy. Tracy has very kindly agreed to be with us this evening if you have got any queries with regards to the policy. So certainly when we get to that part, I'll hand over to Tracy at that stage. The other point I just wanted to make about the policy, very pleased, and you'll note that it's to be reviewed on an annual basis. So we'll be keeping a close eye on that. There are a couple of bills, private member bills, which are currently working their way through the Lords and the Commons. So we'll be keeping an eye on the policy just to make sure that if there are any acts coming in or statutory instruments, that we do pick those up and we reflect those on the when we do the annual review. Also, I have got some additional information from colleagues, from monitoring officer colleagues, with regards to some of their stats, with regards to whistleblowing notifications that they've received, just so that, again, it can put into perspective the numbers that we receive in the Vale. So if I deal with that aspect first, so with regards to Cardiff, for the 3 financial years, I've asked colleagues to provide me the data for the 3 financial years, 2018-19 through to 2020-21. Cardiff, in total, they received over the 3 years 10 whistleblowing notifications. Year by year, it was 1, 7 and 2. Caerphilly, over the 3 years, received 16, 4, 10 and 2 over the 3 years, and Merthyr Merthyr Tydfil, just one. That was one in 2018-19, with no whistleblower notifications in the latter 2 financial years. So it's just to give you a feel for the numbers coming through elsewhere. I did have an opportunity to liaise with the monitoring officer in RCT with regards to the 14 whistleblowing notifications in 2020-21, and certainly the majority of those, there were 14 last financial year, the majority were COVID related, so they saw a particular spike because of COVID issues. I haven't had an opportunity to get clarification from from Caerphilly, with regards to the 10 in 2019-20. They were not COVID related, and obviously that was primarily because that was the pandemic commencing just at the tail end of that financial year. So that just gives you a little bit more detail so you can compare the notifications that we receive in comparison to other authorities. So just to highlight some points in the report, so the promotional work that we've done over the last 12 months or so has been very much along the lines of the traditional promotional activity of data being on the council's website, and also maintaining posters at the council offices on notice boards. Now that we have the revised policy, we'll be planning a further launch to coincide with the 1st of September. So we'll be undertaking some further promotional work with regards to that launch. Also, I know Tracy has arranged for colleagues in the organisational development team to make available some IDEV training, and we'll also be taking the report to strategic leadership team and making sure the policy is rolled out across the departmental management teams across the council. So that's going to be work that we're going to be progressing with. So paragraph 2.3 gives you an overview with regards to the 4 whistleblowing incidents that we've received, with a little bit more detail set out in paragraphs 2.6 through to 2.8, which are also reflected in the various graphs attached at Appendix 1 to the report. So just turning to 2.6, that sets out the directorates where the whistleblowing notifications relate to. 2.7 refers to the outcomes of the investigations following on from the whistleblowing notifications. So as you can see, 16 were not upheld, 5 have been partially upheld, with 1 being upheld, and that related to a whistleblowing notification in social services in 2015-16. Paragraph 2.8 gives you a breakdown as to the nature of those whistleblowing notifications, just so you have a little bit more detail on that. And then in paragraph 2.9, I've just summarised the action arising from the investigation. So without going into the details of any of those specific cases, the action which has followed on from the partially upheld matters and the upheld matter can be summarised as we've revisited processes and procedures, strengthened them where they've been necessary to be strengthened, improved communication with staff, and undertaken staff training. So that's been sort of a key area, and in one instance disciplinary action was taken. So that just gives you really a sort of a flavour, but more than happy to take any questions.
Okay, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you very much. Thank you much, Chair. Just a couple of observations, really. And this is very helpful report, and it's very, very similar in terms of numbers from other local authorities, which is, I think, reassuring in lots of ways. But one area that we do need to explore, and I think it's important that people use the right policy for the right process. And I always think that's an issue in many cases. Like, for example, you know, we probably have got a grievance process, and some people need to use the grievance process rather than whistleblowing. But if obviously things are not being resolved informally in terms of a grievance, or even if it's not resolved very well formally, and it's a major, major issue, and it's obviously involving perhaps potential action that could result in criminal prosecution or serious fraud or anything like that, then clearly it needs to go to the whistleblowing policy. I just wonder about the processes stem from maybe a grievance going forward to a whistleblowing on the advice of maybe a senior officer in the council, perhaps maybe someone in HR perhaps that would recommend that, someone senior in HR to do that, especially when the processes have been fairly exhausted in grievance and still the problem still exists. I also think it's important to reassure people that do use this policy that they are protected. I think a lot of people still feel that complaining about maybe their managers or complaining about procedures which the manager is responsible for, people feel rather frightened. And I still feel that, you know, still low numbers, I feel, overall everywhere. I mean, I know this is a common issue throughout lots of organisations, not just councils. And I just wonder perhaps, you know, it's to do very much with, you know, we don't really want to say anything because, you know, we don't want to get ourselves in trouble by raising an issue. And I still feel that that's something that we've got to do. I think training is a good area that we need to explore. And I think we need to perhaps make sure that that training is almost mandatory upon employees, not just say advisory, but I think mandatory training on whistleblowing is important with some form of test. I mean, in my organisation where I work for, Cardiff and Vale College, we have what we call Skillscape, and we have to have tests at the end to pass those modules. And I just wonder perhaps, do we do this in the Vale Council, or do we just go through training and people then tick a box and say, I've done the training, I'm fine. Have I really learnt anything from it? Well, we can't really measure that. So I think perhaps maybe we could look at that.
I think that Tracy wanted to come in on that.
Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to cover the 3 points if Debbie is happy for me to cover the 3 points off, if that's okay. Yeah, okay, so in relation to whistleblowing and our grievance process, if as part of our grievance process we establish that actually the grievance would be best dealt with through the whistleblowing process, we work very strongly in collaboration with our legal team to ensure that that decision is made and that it's sound, and that anyone who has raised the grievance is afforded protection under the whistleblowing policy. And we do that with, whilst I shall say, a degree of regularity. Obviously you will understand the numbers are very low anyway, but we always give consideration to that when we're reviewing a grievance anyway as a local authority, to ensure that the correct process has been followed. And we do that in support and collaboration with our trade union colleagues if they're involved in that process with us. From a protection perspective, and you're absolutely correct, Councillor Wilson, we need to ensure that people feel protected and that they can speak out and raise an issue if they're particularly concerned about it. And we have been working with our trade union colleagues to ensure that people are aware of how best they can do that and that they are protected once they do that. And our trade union have reviewed this policy with us and feel that this is a really positive step forward to allow people to do that, particularly with the speak out line, which can be which people can call through anonymously on. In terms of training, yes, we will roll out training. We'll roll out training to those that are handling the call first and foremost, and then we'll roll that out to all of our officers. We would like that training to be mandatory, and we'll pick that up as part of our ongoing induction process. In terms of the quality of the training and the how we test the competence of the person,
with any of our training that's rolled out on the IDEV system, we review the quality of that training, and we ensure that that training tests knowledge, and the training that's been undertaken has the necessary tests and applications on that training to ensure that we've tested the knowledge of the individual. We can track if somebody has just flicked through the paragraphs and then attempted to complete the questions. So we can track that, and we regularly do if there's a need for us to. But all of our IDEV training is checked from a quality perspective. We wouldn't upload any training that we don't believe as being quality assured and checked. And we do ensure that that training tests the knowledge of the person once they've completed that piece of work, if that provides some assurance for you, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, it does. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Tracy. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Maybe it's just me being stupid, probably is. In the draft report, Debbie, or the draft policy, when it says what you should report, where it says sexual, physical, verbal abuse from our clients, employees, contractors, or the public, I'm assuming that's staff. If they get grievances from the public, you know, they're the constant complainants. Would that be dealt with whistleblower, or would it be dealt with vexatious?
I think from the way you've described it, it wouldn't be dealt with through this. But you know, I'm happy to work through it in a bit more detail. That you've got particular scenarios that you just wanted some further clarification on.
I'm happy to do that. And another one is damage to the environment. How do you damage the air? You know, again, me being stupid.
Oh, I suppose there's pollution. You know, there's a whole raft of different scenarios.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. It's just, yeah, it just sounded. I looked through it, but yeah, air. Okay.
Okay, thank you for that. I don't see anybody else wishing to come in, so if we move on to the recommendations to note the contents of the report and continue to receive updates, if I could have a seconder for that, please.
Second.
Thank you for that. If we then take that and then move on to the annual internal audit report.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. I'll take us through this report. Very conscious of time and a number of reports to go through, so I'll be as brief as I can. Just to start by saying, though, that this is probably the most important report from an internal audit perspective during the year, and its purpose of the report is to provide the Head of Internal Audit's annual opinion on the Council's control environment in relation to governance, risk management, internal control, and to inform the Governance and Audit Committee of the work and performance of the internal audit team for the financial year 2021. Perhaps before saying that, I'd just like to thank Joan and the rest of the internal audit team for the work they've done over the last 12-18 months in terms of delivering audit work in very different circumstances to normal, and I'll touch a little bit on that as I go through the covering report. Okay, just to take members through the covering report and perhaps to take any questions arising in the detail in the appendix. The background, the public sector internal audit standards require the Head of Internal Audit to provide an annual report to support the annual governance statement, which Caris made reference to the annual opinion earlier on when she went through the annual governance statement. The report should include an opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the Council's framework of governance, risk management, internal control, present a summary of the audit work undertaken, draw attention to any issues that may impact on the level of assurance provided, provide a summary of the performance of the service, and comment on conformance with the public sector internal audit standards. The annual report included at Appendix A covers all those points if members have had the opportunity to have a look at it. In accordance with the standards, the Head of Audit is responsible for developing a risk-based annual audit plan which considers the Council's risk management framework, and for 2021 this was due to be presented in April 2020. However, obviously we had COVID COVID-19 outbreak, which delayed the planning process, as significant new risks and ways of working had to be considered to inform the plan. Therefore, the plan was approved by members on the 24th of September 2020, and that plan recognised there would be a different emphasis due to the impact of COVID-19, risks arising from the pandemic, availability of audit and service staff, and challenges arising from the remote ways of working. The approved plan was also more flexible to be able to respond to changing circumstances and events that may occur during the year as a result of the pandemic. As has already been referred to earlier on in the meeting, the 2021 has seen the COVID-19 pandemic have a major impact on how the council has had to operate and the governance arrangements and processes that were put in place to ensure it could continue to support residents and businesses during this difficult and challenging year. But obviously it had an impact on how audit work was carried out, and all staff worked from home for the year. Audits have been conducted remotely using various digital solutions, holding remote meetings, sharing of information on screens, and sending of data and evidence electronically. And whilst there was a steep learning curve, both for audit staff and auditees, all have adjusted well to the new ways of working. Audits have taken longer in some instances due to responses to draft reports being delayed, where services have been under pressure. In terms of the key issues for consideration, the detailed annual report is included in Appendix A, which summarises the reviews undertaken during the year, including any counter-fraud work, the recommendations made and any control issues identified. A total of 30 reviews were completed with an audit opinion and a total of 80 medium recommendations made. A detailed breakdown is included at Annex 1 of the appendix, and the report also discusses the performance of the service during the year, including benchmarking its performance against other local authorities and highlighting individual staff development and training that has taken place. Progress against the plan is attached at Annex 2. This details the status of each planned review. It should be noted that some reviews listed have no audit opinion, for example, advice and guidance, fraud and irregularity work, and external audit liaison. This is because the work carried out in respect of these items was planned, but the nature of the work does not lead to testing and the formation of an audit opinion. Annex 2 illustrates that most planned audit reviews have been undertaken during the year, despite the pandemic and the impact that has had on service demands, as well as the impact of adapting to remote working. Although the pandemic did have some impact on the delivery of the plan, the level of internal audit coverage was sufficient for me to be able to give an opinion. Where planned work has not been undertaken, assurance has been gained where possible from other sources, such as previous work and coverage in other audits. Some planned reviews were not undertaken during the year following requests from services that were under intense pressure, but they were limited, and they've been rolled forward into the current year's plan. In addition, 2 audits started in 2021 will be completed during this year. Paragraph 2.4 of the current report basically summarises the opinion, taking into account the results of the internal audit reviews completed during the year, the recommendations made and considering other sources of assurance. The head of internal audit's annual opinion on the adequacy and effectiveness of the council's framework of governance, risk management and internal control for 2021 is of reasonable assurance. No significant cross-cutting control issues have been identified that would impact on the council's overall control framework, and the weaknesses identified are service specific. Given the time and the number of reports to go through, I think I'll pause there and happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions or comments from members? I don't see any, so I think we can move on to the recommendation then to consider the report. We've done that, and yes, including the annual opinion. If I could have a seconder, please, and thank you for that, Mark.
Second.
Second, thank you for that. Thanks for that, Mark. If we move on then to the draft annual internal audit strategy.
Hello, yes, I'm taking that. Good evening. Consideration of the Regional Internal Audit Service Strategy and Annual Risk-Based Plan is one of the Governance and Audit Committee's key responsibilities. Therefore, in line with the Public Sector Internal Audit Standards, the Head of Internal Audit must establish a risk-based plan to determine the priorities of the internal audit activity to make sure it's consistent with the organisation's goals. Therefore, the plan should cover the Council's overall control environment, including risk governance, internal controls as far as practical. Therefore, this report presents the strategy and proposed plan for 2021-22 to members. Appendix A is the draft internal annual strategy document for 21-22, and it demonstrates how the internal audit service will be delivered and developed in accordance with our terms of reference. Members can see that the document outlines the definition of internal audit and the requirement of such a function on page 2 of the strategy, which is at page 672 of your pack. The strategy then describes how the plan is developed, considering various sources of information such as the risk register and views of senior managers and directors as to where the audit resources are most needed. The strategy then outlines the risk-based approach that is taken and the methodology which resulted in the development of the 21-22 plan, and this is on page 4 of Appendix A. Section 12 on page 6, which is page 677 of the pack, describes the audit approach, the audit assurance categories and the recommendation categories that will be used during the year. Members, I'd just like to point out to members that this is now a standard approach across all 4 councils that we work with. At Appendix B, which is on page 680 of your pack, it details the proposed plan for 21-22, and it covers all the areas that are perceived to be the highest risk split across directorates. This plan also continues to have regard to the changes due to COVID-19 and remote working. Progress made against the plan will be reported to the Governance and Audit Committee each meeting, and it is believed that the achievement of this plan will provide enough coverage to form an annual opinion at the end of the year. Again, due to time, I'll leave it there, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Joan. Do we have any questions or comments from members? I don't see any, so if we move on to the recommendation to consider and approve the report, if we could have a seconder, please.
Second.
Thank you for that. I think that's unanimous because I don't see any dissent, so thank you for that, Joan. If we move on to the annual corporate fraud report.
Okay, thank you, Chair. That's me again. I'll take you through that. Again, I'll do it quite quickly, but if anyone has any questions or requires any further detail, I'm happy to provide that. So one of the core functions of an effective Governance and Audit Committee is to consider the effectiveness of the Council's risk management arrangements, the control environment and associated anti-fraud and corruption arrangements. So the annual fraud report is at Appendix A, which is at page 688 of the pack, and it summarises how the Council has managed the risk of fraud during 2021. Section 1 of the annual report sets out the impact that fraud has. Obviously, fraud leaves the Council with less to spend on services for residents and cost taxpayers money, but it is not a victimless crime. Not only the lost and stolen money, it also considers the loss of working time investigating and correcting these issues, and it also could lead to poor staff morale. Therefore, the Council sets high standards for both members and officers in order to deal with the allegations and any suspicions of fraud, bribery and corruption. Section 2 of the annual fraud report on page 690 of the pack discusses the proactive work undertaken during 2021, which was based upon the Fraud Strategy and Framework 2018-19 to 2021 Action Plan, and that action plan is detailed more thoroughly in Annex 1 of that report. You will see that some actions have been completed and others will be carried forward to the new plan, which will be part of the new strategy moving forward. Section 3 on page 5 of the annual report, which is 692 of your pack, provides information in respect of the NFI data matches. There have been 2 matches, 2018 and 2020. So table 1 on that page illustrates the final results of the 2018 matching exercise. The exercise resulted in a total of £101,047 being identified as potential fraud or error, with £95,617 being recoverable. There's obviously more detail on Annex 2 of that report. The new biannual NFI data matching exercise started in October 2020 and data was extracted and forwarded to the NFI. These new matches were produced in 2021 and they included potential COVID-19 grant anomalies, which will be due soon. The latest 21-22 match has provided 3,168 matches for further investigation. There's also a single person discount 2021 match. This is an annual exercise, and during this period 1,485 households were identified for review. This review resulted in 192 fraud or errors being identified, and table 2 on page 693 of the pack shows that a total of £117,107 has been identified as recoverable, and again more details are provided in Annex 4 of the report. Section 4 then describes the counter-fraud work undertaken during the year. A total of 8 potential fraud or irregularity matters were referred to internal audit and or the investigation officer for review during 2021, and the details are in table 3 of the report. In addition, various scams have been circulating during the pandemic, and all staff as well as residents are made aware of these by information being circulated through the council's communications team, the fraud update page, or by the investigation officer directly. The council also distributed many grants to businesses and individuals during the year. Prior to this, the proposed processes were discussed with internal audit and the investigation officer to ensure that the controls were sufficient to prevent as much fraudulent claims as possible. Additional assurance was also sought from an independent organisation, CIFAS, and data relating to 1,900 grant applications was checked by this organisation and no concerns were identified. This again provided assurance that checking processes had been successful in the prevention of fraudulent applications. Towards the end of the annual fraud report, section 5 covers joint working and partnerships. During 2021, I'd just like to point out that the local anti-fraud investigators network continued to meet remotely, and it is a great opportunity to share intelligence and knowledge between all the participants. Finally, at section 6, it touches on the national studies and refers to the Audit Wales Raising Our Game Tackling Fraud work that was published in July 2020. This information is being used to develop the next fraud strategy and framework, which will be brought to the Governance and Audit Committee shortly, and will ensure that the counter-fraud work being undertaken now demonstrates continuing improvement. I'm sorry that is very quick, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, Joan. Councillor Wilson.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joan, for that. That was very helpful and very informative. And I'm really delighted to see the amount of money that we are recovering. But there are challenges here because obviously, lots of organisations and to a certain extent some individuals have received COVID grants, admittedly in a very efficient way. Efficient way, though, can also lead to problems, especially about checking the validity of people's applications for funding. And I'm pleased to see that you're working on that. And I think this is something that we do need to go forward on this to realise, can we reclaim some funds if people have applied, wrongly or whatever? And sometimes people may apply wrongly because they weren't given the right information. That's always a problem in any kind of emergency situation, is that some people may apply for things they're not necessarily eligible for. So I think it's important that people understand that. And the other point I like to consider is about, I tried to read some of the documents. I had trouble reading because the colours that you use. Now, I know, admittedly, I should be using the online version because I know that's the right thing to do. But but sometimes it's very difficult to get that on the report while I'm engaging in a meeting like this. So perhaps maybe just reduce the amount of colour, especially background colour, just going forward, and just print it in black and white. It probably saves bit of money as well, and it's only pennies probably, but I just think probably black and white is just easier, especially in relation to your appendices.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Joe?
Yes, if I can just touch on what Councillor Wilson spoke there about the recovery and the challenges within the organisation regarding the grants. Yes, there was a lot of grants to individuals and businesses, and it did go out the door very quickly. As I've said, we did consult with the relevant departments when they were quickly putting some processes and procedures in place, and we did verify them as much as possible. And equally, yes, we did send a lot of data off to CIFAS, which was data matched, and that provided additional assurance. But as you've alluded to, also on the plan, we've got days in this year for financial systems reviews, and again, verification is something that we will have regard to, although obviously we've placed a lot of assurance on the external data matching for the initial grants, but is something we will have regard to. And in respect of the colours, I'll take on board what you say, and I'll try and make it a bit more user friendly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Mark Thomas, I think, would like to come in.
Yeah, just very briefly, just to add to what Joan has said in relation to the COVID grants. I think Joan touched on it in terms of NFI. It also will include, or has included, an element linked to the COVID grants. So when we get those matches through, that would be obviously an area that we'll go through thoroughly and see if there were any potential fraudulent applications or applications submitted which didn't necessarily disclose all the relevant information. That being the case, we will certainly then seek to recover any funds that were paid incorrectly. But at the moment, you know, based on the information we're aware of, we can be confident as we can be that there hasn't been any widespread abuse or any issues for the Vale, and that's similar to the other three authorities that we work with. There have been some examples elsewhere where maybe basic controls weren't put in place in the same way, but I'm pleased to say that wasn't the case in the Vale or the other three authorities that we work with. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mark. Do we have any other questions or comments? I don't see any, so if we move on to the recommendation to note the report and the measures in place, if I could have a seconder, please.
Second.
Thank you. And I think that's endorsed. I don't see any dissent. If we move on to the forward work programme.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll take members through this one fairly quickly. It's the usual report that you're used to seeing, is to provide members with an updated forward work programme for the rest of the year. The change this time, though, just to refer to the paragraph, was it the third bullet point on page 1 of this report, the Local Government and Elections Act Wales requires the Auditor General to produce a timetable for each financial year for each principal council, covering both his functions and those of relevant regulators, CIW and Estyn, and a quarterly work programme update will therefore be provided by Audit Wales, and the first one is appended to this report. So Appendix B basically contains that update from Audit Wales for members' information. It gives an indication of certain timescales for certain pieces of work. But for the next committee meeting in September, it lists the items that we're aware of and we plan to bring forward to the committee in September. There may be some additional items to bring forward near the time, but those are the ones that we plan to bring forward at the current time. So thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Mark. Do we have any comments or questions from members? Councillor Johnson.
Just briefly, Chair. I mean, because we've been here for 2.5 hours. Just a consideration that, and I appreciate that the heat has certainly not helped tonight, but if we have a 700-page set of agenda papers, I'm not personally convinced that we've maybe given all of these issues the justice that they could have had. It's just a consideration going forward that if we start seeing, if you start going towards your agenda conference and you know the papers are unable to get through people's doors, then you know maybe we consider splitting them and having additional meetings to sort of deal with these issues, you know, sort of in the manner which they deserve. But obviously that's a matter for yourself, Chair, and Democratic Services to consider as we go forward in the next few months. Thanks.
Mark.
Yeah, I would like to also echo that. I mean, as the next Chair of Audit, don't be frightened of asking for extra meetings, George. I mean, we all want to give it, you know, the careful consideration, but there were a number of big reports today, and you know, it's worth giving. You know, you could have said finish early when we reconvene the meeting next time to discuss maybe the audit items in particular. You know, another meeting. There's no harm in doing that. But you're still in your first term, George. So I mean, still learning. You know.
Thank you. I will certainly note those comments, and I think they are very fair points in fairness, and duly noted for future. if there are any other questions or comments. If not, thank you all for joining, and we'll I'll see you all at the next meeting.
See you soon. Take care.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.